yourselves so that you don't become yes people, that when people do good, you do good, and when they do bad, you do bad. But be so that when people do good, you're with them, and when they do bad, you refrain from their evil. So it's very important for, you know, and one of the tragedies, obviously, is that any group goes into groupthink. I mean, you know, this is an area you're much more familiar with than I am, but groupthink is a huge problem, and I think the Quran addresses that problem constantly by showing that you have to stand up against the group, because the group, as Nietzsche pointed out, you know, that insanity or madness is unusual amongst individuals, but it seems to be the norm amongst groups. I mean, I think Kierkegaard said that the group was untruth. Said even if a truth, a natural truth, is claimed by a group, instantly it becomes untruth merely because the group has claimed it. Because truth for him was individual in the same sense that you're describing. Do you think that's akin to the Jewish emphasis on the prophetic tradition? Absolutely, yeah. But I also think that the Islamic tradition,
first of all, I was having a fun ride, okay? That wasn't even my run.
You know, this idea that
this is my fun ride. I was just having a fun walk.
People that we need society.
You had it for a long time. It's not yours, it's the old one that you didn't want anymore. You made Mom buy you that fancy one.
I think I put it somewhere. I forgot where it was.
Yeah, I don't know where his is. He's got that fancy one.
No, I didn't hide it. I forgot where I put it.
Yeah.
I put it somewhere. I would find it, but then I forgot.
That's how I was hiding it.
And then Mom moved everything around, so then it must have went missing around those times when Mom was doing stuff.
Okay, so let me ask you a question that's always put to people who are religious. How do you differentiate
that's what it is.
religious belief from idolatry, from ideological belief? I know personally I don't think they're the same, by the way, but I'm curious about, you know, because it's pretty easy for someone just to say, well, you talk about standing up against the collective, but you Christians, you Jews, you Islamic types, you're part of a mob just like everybody else, and why does your particular mob view reign supreme in your view? Why isn't that just another idol in the desert, just like the rest of them? What makes it different, do you think?
What?
Well, I think that you can, you know, as the Lord said, 'tis idolatry to make the service greater than the God. It's very easy to turn a religion into an idol. And I think
if you did put that pen in my room and I find it, I will break it.
The fact that religious belief can be, maybe it can be hijacked for instrumental and dogmatic purposes. Yeah, as if ideology isn't, as if anything.
You know what, you rule, you're banned from my bedroom.
Ban you from the house. Someone said ban you from the house.
I said ban you from my room, not house. I didn't say house, I said room.
It's great. The 20th century is largely an irreligious century in the Western Hemisphere.
You better watch it. If he decides to ban you from the house, how about anybody knows that?
Religious ideologies. This point has been pointed out by many people. So one of the things about, you know, are you familiar with Errol Colloy?
Statements like that.
NAI. No, I'm not. K-L-N-I. Yeah, NAI. So he was a Hungarian Jew who converted to Catholicism, but he wrote a very interesting paper in 1951 called The Three Riders of the Apocalypse. He also wrote a book about Nazi Germany in 1938.
Apocalypse?
I think really, tell me his name again.
What even is this? Why are you recording this while doing your sizing? Why?
Well, we're spying on the clouds.
Yeah.
So anyway, he wrote an essay called The Three Riders of the Apocalypse. And he identified three totalitarian ideologies. He said the first two, fascism and communism, were easy to recognize. But he said that the real dangerous one was progressive liberalism, because the seeds of totalitarianism were not seen very easily. It was something that could be missed. So I think if I had to choose, let's say, if I had to choose the leader of a country, let's say an arbitrarily powerful leader, it seems to me that it would be a better
choice for me to select someone who believes that he's beholden to something above and beyond himself than to choose someone who doesn't have that belief at all. And that seems to me, regardless of what you might say philosophically or even scientifically about the utility of religious belief or the validity of religious belief, the notion that you could be the leader of a powerful country and not be serving something that wasn't only you seems to be a real problem with let's say, a stringently atheistic philosophy, because, well, why wouldn't you just serve you in a position like that?
Well, and you would need, generally, it's the religious traditions that understand service is for not just the self. I mean, we obviously have to serve ourselves just to live, but service to others. And that's why political leaders in the pre-modern world, it was always understood that they had the greatest burden of self-discipline, that they had a greater burden of self-discipline than everybody else.
Because they have greater power and greater temptation.
And so the religious traditions, I mean, the pre-modern world understood very well, in whatever civilization you were in, they understood very well that the central problem that human beings are confronted with is their self. And that the modern world has completely lost that idea, that you had to master yourself. Hence, one of the things that Confucius said is that that study without thinking is blindness, but thinking without study is dangerous, right? And so, if you don't study those things that will equip you to deal with the self, and that's why in our tradition and in all the great traditions, but in the Islamic tradition, the study of the self, psychology, ilm nafs, it's termed in Arabic, it was central to our tradition, to understanding the nature of the self, to understanding the machinations of the self, the tricks of the self, how and to understand those things so that you could learn to discipline them. I mean, this gets back to, Imam al-Ghazali uses the idea of the sage, the dog, and the pig, which obviously, Plato would have said the charioteer and the two horses. It's the same idea, but, the pig is the concupiscent soul, the dog is the irascible soul, and then the sage is the rational soul. If the sage is in charge, then things will turn out well. But if you allow the pig or the dog to take over, in our culture, the pig has definitely, the pig seems to really be having a field day, right? The pig is doing very well.
The dog is not doing too bad either.
Well, it's interesting because, exactly, and I think the world is split. Willy Brandt back in the 70s saw this north-south problem of he didn't term it like this, but I see it as the pig and the dog. If you have affluence on one spectrum and you have real just diminution of goods, just of human goods on the other, you're going to create a lot of resentment. And so that's a huge problem that we have. So this idea, Frost talked about fire and ice. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. He was talking about this, the dog and the pig. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire, right? In other words, the world's end will come from the pig just wreaking havoc. But then he said, but if it had to occurs twice, I think of,
So let me ask
for destruction. Yeah, ice is
sorry.
Yeah.
No, sorry, please finish that. Ice is...
Yeah. That hate is also great and will suffice. That the irascible can do it as well. It's one or the other. It's either going to be fire or ice. Okay. But that's in the absence. That's in the absence of the sage. That's in the absence of wisdom. And wisdom is a word that's not often heard.
Yes, well, I've had a lot of discussions with people who regard themselves as explicitly atheistic, and it seems to me that a lot of the discussion about religious belief in atheism misses the mark, let's put it that way. I tend to think of God, if I'm thinking about the idea of God psychologically, I tend to think about something akin to a hierarchy of values, and that's very much similar to the proposition that you're putting forward with the metaphor of the pig and the dog and the sage. That there are some values that are higher than others. And so I would say, I think that's psychologically true, that there are some values higher than others. I mean, we tend to put our families before ourselves, for example. And we tend to have a sense that we would like to be good people. I use this illustration of the relationship between values. Imagine that you're making a meal. You might ask yourself, well, what are you doing? Say you're cutting up vegetables. Okay, so you're moving your hand back and forth. That's not abstract at all. That's where the mind meets the body. You're moving your hand back and forth to cut the vegetables, to put them in the pot, to cook a good dinner, to be a good father, to be a good husband, to be a good citizen, to be a good person. So you're doing all those things at the same time, right? And each of the more particular things nests in the broader value. And the broader a value is, the more other values depend on it. And also maybe the broader a value is, the more other people can be united within it. And so I think you can come to a technical understanding of something like depth of value. And then it seems to me that the religious proposition is that there's an ultimate value that's either at the pinnacle or at the base, depending on how you conceptualize the metaphor. And that ultimate value is expressed in religious terminology as the absolute, the ineffable absolute, as the God that's supposed to be served. And in some sense it has to remain ineffable and beyond comprehension, because otherwise it turns into an idol. And so what you do in a religious sense is posit an ultimate ideal, subordinate yourself to it, regard it as something that you can only ever approximate to, even in principle, and organize all the other virtues and defeat the faults in relationship to that highest order value. And that's more like, I think part of the reason that religious traditions insist upon faith isn't, it's not the faith that the scientist types criticize, which is sort of like an empirical statement about the structure of objective reality. It's more like the notion that there is a hierarchy of values and that there's something that has to be absolute, ineffable, and ultimately uniting at the apex that we should be subservient to, that we should consider all our behaviors in relationship to. And so that's, there's not a metaphysics there in some sense, because I'm not saying anything about the final nature of that absolute value, right? That's an ontological question. I don't feel qualified to answer it. But I can't see how there can be an absence of an absolute unifying value that's superordinate to all other values without society degenerating into conflict, without people becoming anxious and confused and aimless, without the consequences being that we all miss the mark. So I guess I'd like your comments about that idea.
I don't think God's something that we posit. I think, and I also certainly don't think God is a value. I think that we respond to God, and that God makes a call, and that call is through these intermediaries. And the prophets, the Quran says in the chapter called the Bee, that there's no nation that hasn't been given warners that say shun idols and worship God. And so
I wasn't trying to, what would you say, reduce God to a human value. Because
but a lot of people do. I mean,
I know that.
I understand that way of viewing God. Yeah.
Well, that's why I insisted upon the ineffability.
Well, yeah. However you want to state that. I mean, for us, for Abrahamic people in particular, God, that we respond to God. God makes a call, and that call is through the prophets. And the prophets are surprisingly consistent, unlike philosophers, who the student invariably rejects the master. Plato is a friend, but the truth is a greater friend. Whereas the prophets are extraordinarily consistent in their messaging, that there is a God, that God demands that you live within the limits that God has set as your creator. I mean, one of the things that atheists not as a deep spiritual sickness to deny your creator. Whether that creator is a personal creator is the next stage that you're going to have to ask yourself. But to deny your createdness is something quite extraordinary by saying there's no creator.
So how do you deal with the challenges, the hypothetical challenges presented to the notion of created human beings, the conflict between that and modern evolutionary theory as a modern thinker? I mean, the Catholics have accepted evolutionary theory, but that's my understanding of the situation.
Yeah, guided evolution, not this idea of randomness. I mean, the best response to that is, I think, Robert Frost's poem called Accidentally on Purpose. That would be my answer. Somebody can, if they're interested, can Google it and look at it. But, this idea that randomness that created this, I won't buy that. And if they want to say it's because I don't understand evolution, that's fine. I'll accept that.
Well, I talked to Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins recently. I'm going to release the discussion I had with Dawkins, and the randomness argument's an interesting one because it's the variability between people that's in some sense random, but sexual selection plays an awfully powerful force in evolutionary biology, and sexual selection is anything but random. And so to me, I see the action of consciousness in perhaps in the ultimate sense operating not least through the mechanism of sexual selection. So the selection mechanisms aren't random, even if the variation might be generated in part randomly. It seems to me that there's something there that would reconcile the relationship in modern biology between the spirit and matter, let's say. So, because consciousness calls matter into being in some real sense. So,
well, consciousness also for us is a spiritual phenomenon. It's not a material phenomenon. And the ancients said that the one who denies the soul, that you'd have to determine him an idiot. They really saw it as a kind of absurdity to deny the existence of a soul. Because it's so clear, if anybody's ever seen a corpse, that something's very profoundly missing.
So, let's go back to practicalities with regards to Islam. And also I'd be interested in, you said that you chose, so I want to know what following the Islamic faith has done for your life personally. How has it helped you put yourself together? And also, I'm interested in, again, why you found the Islamic tradition preferable, let's say, to the Orthodox tradition, that you did enjoy the rituals that were part of that, at least. So let's deal with practical issues first. So,
in terms of why I chose Islam, I mean, I'm not completely convinced that I chose Islam. I mean, in some ways, Islam chose me as well. So it's, guidance is a very strange thing for people. Like, I saw an inevitability. When I look back on what happened, I saw an inevitability of my embracing Islam. I had some very interesting experiences that could be termed mystical, or however you want to determine them. But the tradition itself, what struck me was, one, I got to keep all of the prophets that I believed in already, and I added in addition what we consider to be the final prophet. And just as very often Christians marvel at how Jews miss Jesus, Muslims also marvel at how Christians and Jews miss Muhammad. Although, to be fair to the Jews, they do acknowledge the prophet as a providential force, and they do acknowledge him as a Noahidic messenger preparing the way for the coming of the Messiah. So they do recognize that he was a providential force. At least the great, to read George Coller's book on Jewish theology, as a chapter on Judaism and Islam. And certainly the great father of Orientalism, Ignaz Goldziher, he actually said that he felt that Islam was the only religion that somebody of a philosophical bent could actually accept. And he wanted to really just as Judaism prepared the way for Christianity, it was Islam that prepared the way for a philosophical Western Christendom. Because if you look at the transmission of all of that knowledge that comes into Europe, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas, who's 13th century, he dies in 1274, and yet he's the doctor of the church. Just look at the number of times he quotes Muslims. I mean, he calls Averroes the commentator. So I think Islam, and, you know, one of the beauties of the religion to me is that you'll find whatever you're looking for in it. I mean, Islam, it has a very simple theology that anybody can understand in sort of the Ikhlas, the chapter that says, say God is unique, God is completely independent, God neither gives birth nor was God born, and there's nothing like God. So it gives you a very simple theology that anybody can understand, and yet embedded in that simplicity is an extraordinary complexity that actually created a metaphysical tradition that Western scholars have spent their lifetime studying. People like Henri Corinne or somebody. It's like Maxime Rodinson, not Maxime Rodinson, but the great Catholic theologian and metaphysician Jacques Maritain. You know, recognize the genius of people like Al-Hallaj and things. So within the Islamic tradition, there's just an extraordinary spectrum. You can spend your entire life and have a satisfying life, and I know people that have done this, just mastering the recensions of the Quran and the qira'at, the actual oral expression of the Quran through the rules of tajweed. You can spend your life studying exegesis. You can spend your life studying prophetic tradition. You can spend your life studying the great mystics of Islam. We have the best poets in the world. We also have the best architecture. I mean, there's nothing like the Taj Mahal or the Alhambra Palace. And even Western architecture, if you read Stealing from the Saracens, she shows how some of the finest Western architecture was basically taken from the Islamic civilization, including Notre Dame in Paris. So you can find incredible, I know people that just came to Islam through music. I mean, I know some really professional musicians that fell in love with Arabic music, which led them into Muslim culture. People that love just, I mean, one of the most interesting things about Islam is it is a truly universal religion in that you can go from Indonesia to California and find all of these different expressions of the same central truths of Islam with their own local colorings. So the West African Muslims are not like the Middle Eastern Muslims. The Middle Eastern Muslims are not like the Indian Muslims. And you have people like, you know, one of the great Impressionist painters of Sweden. I think he's actually considered a national treasure in Sweden. But his paintings hang in the museum there. He became Muslim in jail for actually he shot a matador because he was raised by his father was a veterinarian, and he shot a matador because he was so horrified that they were bringing bullfighting into France, and there was such an uproar that they actually released him. But when he was in jail, he befriended an Algerian who used to recite Quran all the time, and he ended up becoming Muslim and then studying in Egypt, and then going back to his native land. He died in Spain, but extraordinary individual. So you have people like that. You have people that anybody can find what they're looking for, and that is the power of the faith. I think is that it is truly a universal faith. And I think one of the things that Western people tend to do, one, they don't recognize that it's a Western faith because it is. It's part of the Abrahamic faith. It was in Spain for centuries. It's been in Eastern Europe for centuries. And even Istanbul, which is the great capital of Islam for centuries, is half in Europe and half in the East. And that's why it really bridges these two worlds. And so there's so much. I mean,
why did part of the reason why I think it makes sense for religious people, Christians, Jews, and Islamic alike to focus on their commonalities in the face of the things that are disintegrating our cultures. We could start by trying to make some peace between us if we're going to consort ourselves reasonably as religious individuals.
Right. And I commend you for trying to do some bridge building because, arguably, there's been so much negativity around this faith and around its adherents that there's an almost instantaneous association with the most negative aspects of humanity with the religion. And it's quite tragic. And so just as an exercise, a kind of bracketing for a second and try to think about things, a mentor of mine and a friend of mine, Dr. Thomas Cleary, wrote a book called Zen Koans. He also translated the Quran. He's one of the brilliant translators of our lifetime. But he wrote a book called Zen Koans, and in the introduction of that book, he actually says that the purpose of a koan is to snap people out of sloppy
I read
thinking.
that book. Yeah.
But he says in there, but you don't need a koan to do that. Just ask an educated Western person what they think about Islam, and they'll start expressing all of these prejudices. And if you ask them, have you ever read the Quran? No. Do you know anything about the Prophet Muhammad? No. Other than maybe something they read in a newspaper article or in Time or Newsweek or the Atlantic Monthly.
Yeah, well, it's not an easy thing to try to get a toehold in a different tradition, especially
it's
when
not that
you
hard.
have a toehold in your own.
Yeah, it's not that hard, especially for an educated person. You're obviously a highly educated person. It's not that hard. Islam. One of the things Gibbon said is that Islam spread because it was a very easy religion to understand. So this idea that I can't understand it, I'm having a hard time. It's not that hard to understand. I mean, Islam is actually very straightforward.
Okay, then give me a 5-minute summary of the core beliefs. I don't want to put you on the spot. It's not a question.
No, that's not hard at all.
So lay it out. That would be very helpful.
So we have a famous hadith in which we're told that the angel Gabriel came in the form of a man and asked the prophet, tell me about faith. And the Prophet Muhammad said, faith is to believe that there's only one God, and that Muhammad, which includes all the previous messengers, is a messenger of God, to believe in angels, to believe in the books that God has revealed, to believe in the last day, the day of judgment, and to believe in the measuring out of good and evil, that good and evil is part of life. And then he said, tell me about Islam. And he said, Islam is that you make the testimony of faith, that you pray 5 times a day, that you fast Ramadan, that you pay zakat, the 2.5% of your standing wealth at the end, not your income tax, but your standing wealth at the end of a year, that's a whole year. 1/40th is given to poor people. There's 8 categories that are given in the Quran. And that you, if you're able to, you make a pilgrimage once in your lifetime to Mecca. And then he said, tell me about ihsan, which is the 3rd dimension of Islam. And he said, and this is the dimension of virtuous being, like being a person of arity, of excellence in the world. And he said, ihsan is to worship God as if you see God. And if you don't see him, at least you know that he sees you. So you have an awareness of that there is a divine presence, and you should be in a state of awareness in your behavior. I mean, one of the things about, if you're driving and everybody's speeding and then somebody sees a cop, they all suddenly slow down. I have a friend once who just zoomed past the cop when everybody slowed down, and he pulled him over. And he said, why did you slow down? He said, I felt like a hypocrite. So the guy let him go. But, that's people when they're in the presence of authority, they tend to behave well. Unless they're an utter rebel. I mean, there are those people.
I'm trying to figure out how to be a Jew and a Christian and a Muslim at the same time.
But become Muslim, that's the best way. Because the beauty of Islam is you get the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Last Testament. I mean, that really is, for me, even the Jews Jews acknowledge this, because Islam in many ways is a universalized Judaism. It's Judaism for the Gentiles. We have the mikvah, they do ghusl, we have ghusl, which is the ritual, the baptism, a total immersion in water ritually to purify yourself, which is done at least once a week. And
okay, so let me ask you, maybe I'll ask you, because we're going to run out of time. I want to ask you a final question, then you can maybe help me in my aim. I've been trying to understand the Christian doctrine of the Word and its relationship to the Jewish prophetic tradition for a long time, and I know that Christ is a central figure in Islam as well. And the Christians make the claim that Christ is the Son of God, right? He's the Messiah himself, and it's very difficult, if you're going to be a Christian, not to accept that claim. And I think I understand the claim in some sense psychologically. I think the notion that the free word, the free truthful word, is the fundamental redeeming force. I believe that's true. I think it's true literally, and I think it's true metaphorically, and I suspect it might be true religiously, although I'm not exactly sure what that means. And I think part of the stumbling block for me in relationship to Islam, you can understand Christianity in relationship to Judaism, but I can't understand Islam in relationship to Christ, because I understand the Christian idea that Christ was a transcendent consequence of the prophetic tradition, and the Christian insistence that his life is associated with the divinity of the Word, and that is in some sense a final statement. And so I don't understand how Islam moves beyond that and still places Christ in a place of centrality.
Well, the Jews don't accept Christ at all. Like the best of the Jews will say he was a rabbi, but many of the rabbis considered him to be a charlatan, a magician. And Jesus in the Talmud, which was printed by Princeton University Press, makes that argument that the Talmudic views of Christ, which he argues in that book that it was understandable given that the Jews were so persecuted by the Christians. But the Muslim theology is I think it's a radical monotheism that even I think it transcends the monotheism of Judaism, which has some anthropomorphic elements in it that the Muslims would not accept. But generally, the Jews and the Christians agree on the theology. The rabbis, I've had many talks with rabbis, and they see Islam. In fact, Kohler says that Muslims were always seen as full proselytes of the Noahidic laws, whereas Christians were not because of the Trinity. So the Trinity is, the principle of the triad is, in Plato in the Tenets that talks about that. So the principle of the triad is a very powerful principle, and there are many, many trinities in the world that we see. So it is understandable.
I don't understand exactly why that constitutes such a stumbling block. Again, I'm trying to speak at least to some degree psychologically.
Well, if you read, sorry.
It seems to me that the idea of the Holy Ghost is allied with the idea of conscience. That voice that speaks from within. And then the idea of the Son element of the Trinity, that's the fact that divinity can reveal itself within a personality. And then the idea of God himself, the God the Father, that seems to me to be the idea that's most tightly associated with the Jewish idea of the Absolute and the Islamic idea of Allah.
Well, I don't think so, because if you read Meister Eckhart or even Aquinas on Trinity, but Eckhart, the Godhead, is infinite, cannot be embodied, is simple, there's no parts. So I think if you get into deep Catholic theology, you'll find that in the end it is a type of unity. So the personas, and they are called personas in Latin, means mask in Latin. There's a mask, right? And so for Muslims, Christ is a central figure, and Muslims do believe in a second coming of Christ. born of the virgin birth, but Christ is not divine. Christ is human. And you'll find that in the dual nature, not in the monophysite or the diaphysite traditions of Christianity that you find like in Coptic Christianity and some of the monophysites that believed in that Christ was purely divine, but in this idea that Christ is of a dual nature. So the Logos inheres, and that's a mystery. But this idea, Catholics never call, like evangelicals, they don't call on Christ as, when they pray, they call on God, the Father, through an intercession of Christ, which is, I think, very different from worshiping Christ as the Godhead. And I think it becomes very confusing, even for
I think it is. I think it is confusing, and the fact that it is one of the stumbling blocks to something approximating a union of the great Abrahamic traditions is quite a problem. And
well, we can agree on a lot of things. I mean, we certainly agree that there is a God, that He created us. We agree that the prophets were sent to warn people and to give them good news, and we agree that there's a day of judgment and people are going to be resurrected. I mean, those are some pretty strong things to base a sense of shared concern on. We certainly agree on family. We agree on the importance of raising children healthy. We all share the liberal arts tradition. Muslims, Christians, and Jews all share the tradition of the liberal arts, which is very important.
Maybe we could start in our efforts to move forward by concentrating on those things that unite us.
Well, also virtue, like virtue ethics. I mean, all three of our religions share virtue ethics, all three. And we all really acknowledge and really have benefited greatly from the Nicomachean ethics. All three traditions recognize the Nicomachean ethics and its importance. And that's why our ethical tradition, our great treatises, reflect many of the truths that Aristotle articulated in the Nicomachean ethics.
Well, I think we should probably call that a day. I would like to keep talking to you. I think it's very useful to outline, the central tenets of Islamic faith. I think it's very useful to begin a reconceptualization in some sense in the intellectual sphere that it might be useful for all the people of the Abrahamic traditions to recognize their similarities moving forward rather than concentrating on their differences. And we could start by assuming that perhaps our differences are in some sense apparent and a consequence of our ignorance. You know what I mean? It's not like any of us can claim to be omniscient interpreters even of our own faith tradition. And so we could say, well, there's a lot of confusion that reigns and that disunites us, and we'll be a little careful about making any authoritative claims on behalf of our own faith, and see, because we need to figure out how to tolerate each other and to appreciate each other. And I also think the disunion between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is also one of the sicknesses that besets the West. The fact that that disunity exists makes it more difficult for people who are searching for something akin to a tradition to believe that there's something solid there, because even those who are staunch adherents of their own traditions don't seem to be able to get along with those who are staunch traditions holders of others. So, anyways, discussions like this are some markers on the pathway to peace, let's say.
We have an important tradition from our prophet that says, "Woe unto those who arrogate to themselves the judgment of God."
Yeah, that's for sure.
And he was asked, how do they do that? And he said, by saying these people are in hell and these people are in paradise. So that's something no Muslim is permitted to like I could never say you're going to hell, or some people do that, but it's absolutely prohibited in the Islamic tradition to do that.
Well, the problem with making a judgment like that is it's pretty easily turned upon yourself.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
It was really good of you to talk to me today. I appreciate it very much.
All right. I have a message here. My camera person who set this up just put a little message. He wanted me to mention the hadith of the Prophet, in which he said, "None of you will enter paradise by your actions, but by the grace of God alone." So we need deeds.
chance to speak again. Where are you located?
I'm in Berkeley, ground zero for the dissolution of the Western civilization.
Yeah. I'm coming to California in very soon. Maybe I'll see if you'd like to come.
Well, if you do, yeah, sure, and come visit the college. You know, we have a small liberal arts college, and you know, we're trying to revive a tradition that's fallen on hard times.